friend of mine called me this week that I'd worked with some time ago. He's one of my associates, and he was responsible in our student ministry when I was at Pioneer Drive for the programming portion of what we did with students. We did a lot of videos, created them on our own, just did a lot of things that involved programming in a variety of ways. He reminded me of something that I hadn't thought about in a long time, and I was pretty consistent with interns in saying things that I would say things to get their attention, and they remembered a lot more things than what I ever recall saying, and so I'm credited for. Some of it's good, and some of it probably not so good. But one of the things that I'd said to them at one time is that wisdom, I feel like, comes more from knowing the right question than knowing the right answer. And so I challenged them to, in their ministry, in the way that we would think about how we would convey a message to students, I wanted them to understand the importance of asking the right questions, because if we can learn to get to the right questions, then we can find the answers that will help us to develop our faith. Questions are important in Scripture. We don't see them often in Scriptures, I suppose. A lot of times in Jesus' ministry, the questions that were asked Him were really a way to interrogate Him or to entrap Him. And so oftentimes the questions that we see don't really help us in our faith development, and it's up to us really to kind of understand how we can use questions to develop our own faith. This morning we're going to read a story about an Ethiopian eunuch. And if you listened to the very end of our podcast last week, you know that I'm not talking about the road to Emmaus. Okay, by your laughter, I know not many of you listened to the end. I think I got confused with the two stories. Both involve people who are walking, and then also remembering that we had people at an Emmaus walk this weekend. The Ethiopian eunuch was reading Scripture. It's a Scripture from Isaiah. It's a Scripture that when we read it, we begin to connect very quickly with the message that's there. It's something that we've talked about a lot. We will use that particular text or some like that around Advent time to help us to understand the birth of Jesus. And sometimes we look at that and we think that they very clearly at this point, even early in the gospel presentations throughout the New Testament, feel as if they sort of understood what the meaning of that passage was. But as you read Isaiah and you try to understand not just that particular passage as it relates to Jesus and His death and burial and resurrection, when you read the entirety of that book, we get the heart of a prophet who was still trying to understand and get his life and mind wrapped around a nation, Israel, who struggled in many ways, in many different ways, with this sense of exile in their life. Now, this sense of exile oftentimes came about because of their own disobedience or their own sin, their own rebelliousness. And so very clearly we understand that in our faith life, that when we go through those times in our life, there's a distance that's created in our experience, and we in a sense have this feeling and this sense of exile in our relationship to God. And so in describing this, the prophet writes this passage about the Lamb. And so this eunuch, this Ethiopian eunuch, is reading that passage. And he has a question. He wants to know more about the meaning of this passage. And so we read this morning our text in Acts chapter 8, and we capture a bit of the story. In Acts chapter 8, starting in verse 26, it says this: "Now an angel of the Lord said to Philip, 'Go south to the road, the desert road, that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza.' So he started out, and on his way he met an Ethiopian eunuch, an important official in the charge of the treasury of the Kandake, which means queens of Ethiopians. The man had gone to Jerusalem to worship." Now, we don't want to assume at this point that he was either Jewish or had converted to Judaism, or assume that he was a believer at this time. But he was simply gone there to, as well as we know, to participate in whatever worship there was an opportunity for. Then so the Spirit told Philip, let me back up. He had gone to Jerusalem to worship, and on his way home he was sitting in his chariot reading the book of Isaiah the prophet. The Spirit spoke to Philip, "Go to that chariot and stay near it." Then Philip ran up to the chariot and heard the man reading Isaiah the prophet. "Do you understand what you're reading?" Philip asked. You see, the question was already born in his heart. But Philip had the opportunity at the prompting of God to encounter him and to ask him about the question that was really already in his mind and in his heart, his experience. He responded this way, "How can I unless someone explains it to me?" So he invited Philip to come up and to sit with him. And this is the passage of Scripture that the eunuch was reading. "He was led like a sheep to the slaughter, and was as a lamb before its shearer is silent, so he did not open his mouth. In his humiliation he was deprived of justice. Who can speak of his descendants? For his life was taken from the earth." So even in this text we have the opportunity, or Philip has the opportunity, to create this picture in this man's life for who this person was. Then the eunuch asked Philip, he said, "Tell me, please, who is this prophet talking about, himself or someone else?" And then Philip began with that very passage of Scripture and told him the good news about Jesus. As they traveled along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, "Look, here's water. What can stand in my way of being baptized?" And he gave orders to stop the chariot. Then both Philip and the eunuch went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. When they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord suddenly took Philip away, and the eunuch did not see him again, but went on his way rejoicing. Philip, however, appeared at Azotus and traveled about, preaching the gospel in all the towns until he reached Caesarea. I've wondered this week about our own curiosity, about our experience in faith life, and this desire that we have to know more. And I wonder sometimes if that desire for us to know more is simply to know more answers, or to know more about this relationship that we might want. I want to suggest this morning that we take the opportunity to move into an experience of curiosity. That we try to encounter Christ in our life in a new way, in a fresh way. One that kind of takes us out of this casual comfort zone that we develop sometimes. And let God speak into us. This experience of Philip is quite interesting. It's interesting in that we have someone who has come to this place where they have began a ministry, much like the disciples and apostles that we've already read about in other places in Acts, and we see the evolvement of the church in the early stages. And as he goes about preaching, God's doing a work in his life, and we know that. Because there came a time that's presented here in Scripture where the Spirit of God spoke to him and he heard it. I'm curious, when was the last time you heard the voice of God? And maybe you don't learn that way. Maybe that's not a part of your experience. Maybe just the thought of that makes you uncomfortable. I can't retract the question. What I mean by that is that question is still out there. It's lingering. I think it's the right question. Do we live our life and pattern our life in such a way and live such a curious life that we would want to hear from God? Or maybe we find ourselves too busy talking to God. Maybe we've got so much going on in our mind, in our heart, that we really don't pause long enough to really listen to anything that God might want to say to us, because in our faith life, we're really just too busy talking. I'm talked out. I left this week to go on a retreat for a group of staff and deacons of another church. And as I was coming home yesterday, it was in the Waco area, and I was driving back, fighting, trying to stay awake. And I thought, getting my mental preparation going for getting ready to talk to you today, I think I'm just talked out. But I was afraid, because I know if I'm around family, and I stopped and had in Abilene, had dinner with the girls before I came on over, And I thought, they're going to think something's wrong if I'm not talking. But I just about have it all to say. Well, I know that I have to be careful in my faith life. I'm a talker. A lot of times I feel, and my excuse is I feel that that's the way that I learn, by talking to someone and talking something out, and through that something's kind of revealed in my spirit. But I'm also curious enough that in my faith life, I want to be able to hear the voice of God when God speaks to me. I think this is interesting. In this story that we have of Philip, this young evangelist who's preparing not just his ministry, but his theology as well. I know I keep going over and over this, but we have to remember that the theology of God and the resurrection is in its infancy. It's still developing, maybe sometimes rapidly, but to think that he had already associated this passage of Scripture with the resurrection of Jesus is significant. Maybe he was curious. Whether or not he was curious, he was putting himself in a position where he could hear the voice of God, and the Spirit prompted him. And in prompting him, he was obedient. And he approached this Ethiopian, this one who he saw reading Scripture. In our outline, I put 3 thoughts that I had and then 3 questions, because I wanted us to get to the right questions. And the question I have for us in regard to this and to our own obedience and ability to hear the voice of God is this: where is God taking you? In your pattern, are you just walking through life? Are you going to work or going down the halls or walking and going or moving from place to place, not really aware that God may be ready to move you, to speak to you, to participate in what He's already began? Or are we just trying to get to where we're going? In this process, what we see in this text is that God not only prompts Philip. Philip was at that place and had that relationship with God where when God spoke to him, he heard His voice. And let me add here that it's also important that we recognize God's voice. Or we recognize that voice when it speaks to us as being from God. You're probably not going to recognize that voice unless you have a relationship with Him and you spent time with Him and maybe you've heard His voice before. But as he goes on, what we have to realize is that in our world and in our life, in our own personal day-to-day experience, we want to come to this understanding that God is not only speaking to us and hopefully we can hear Him, but listen, God is speaking to others. Wow, if I forget this sometimes, that as I walk past people or as I encounter people, that there could be something in their life. There could be something in their experience that has created for them a curiosity about this relationship with Jesus Christ. Or maybe if they don't have that understanding of who God is, maybe they just know something is missing in their life. And I believe that God has created us that way. We're created in His image. So unless we have that relationship with Him, we know something is missing. Most of us here found that already. But wow, we encounter people throughout our world, throughout our life. And if God is already speaking to them, what that means for us is that God has already prepared us for them. If we'll only be obedient. If we'll only hear God. It's significant, isn't it? It's significant for us, I believe, and I think it's helpful if we understand that we don't have to come up with the right questions. The pressure's off. It's on someone else because God has already planted the questions in their heart. One of the guys that was at this retreat was a barista at Common Grounds Coffee Shop in Waco. It's a good stop if you're ever through there. There's a couple of them. There's a brand new store. And he and I got to talking during one of the breaks, and I'd forgotten that barista experience, how people want to talk to you while they're making their drink. One of the ladies who was a frequent guest or frequent customer of ours when I was running the coffee shop, she and I came up with this. I don't remember which one of us came up with it first. We called it barista therapy. It was interesting in that process how people would just come up and they would start talking about things, and it became so aware at those moments that they really had the questions born in their heart already, that we didn't have to start a spiritual conversation with them. That God had already started it in their heart. There was already something that was taking place in them. And if we can only, as God's evangelists to this world, evangelists meaning those people who carry the good news that we understand about who Jesus is. If we only take that and with that preparation in our heart and our life, understand that God is already speaking to others and opening the door for us so that we don't even have to ask the questions. The questions are already in their heart. And this Ethiopian, I think it's clear that he was curious. I think it's clear that he was ready to receive what Philip was going to share with him. And he took this story in Isaiah and he began to describe to him Jesus. I wish we could read that. I wish that there was more written there about how he did that, how he turned that corner in the conversation, and it became clear to us. But if we know Jesus, and if we've had that experience and we read that text, we get a grasp for ourselves of the significance of what Jesus did for every one of us. Start with their questions and take them as quickly as you can to Jesus. Who might be waiting for you? I wonder if that is the right question. I wonder if it's a question that might help frame our week. I wonder if tomorrow as I get out into my schedule, I wonder if God can help me take my eyes and let them be His eyes as I see the world. And maybe I will find opportunities that are waiting for me. The other thing I noticed is that he was present in God's time. He was present in God's time. Now, I write the outline and turn it in by Wednesday evening or Thursday morning. And so when I got back and I go through my process on Sunday mornings of reviewing what I had written, I read that and I thought, present in God's time. Took me a second. Then I recalled. You see, oftentimes in our experience and even in our curiosity, we don't enter into that place where we practice being present. I kept telling myself over and over this weekend as I knew I was going to be in a room with 25 people that I wasn't familiar with at all. To practice presence. When someone was going to be talking to me, I wanted to focus on them because I do tend to get a little bit distracted sometime. My mind wanders. I'm guilty of that. And so I knew I was preparing myself to focus and to be present with the people who were there with me. And if they cornered me for a conversation, that I wanted to be present so that I could hear what it was that they were struggling with or had difficulty with. I wanted to be open to that. I think that's the openness that Philip demonstrates for us. It's not a Samaritan story. It's not one of those things where he found himself too busy or distracted and he wasn't paying attention. He found himself with someone who desperately wanted to know more. And he practiced presence with them. And through that, through the experience of God's time and this experience and relationship together, they were able to create a relationship. They were able to talk about Jesus. And in talking through this, he followed through. Why do you wait? Why do I wait? Why do, in our experience and getting to know people and hearing God and being present with them, what are we afraid of in our experience? The Ethiopian eunuch saw some water and he said, Why can't I just be baptized now? I like that kind of faith. I like that kind of curiosity. One of my goals this year is to be 80% right. You see, I think all of us struggle with certain degrees of perfectionism. And sometimes we're hesitant to act, to follow through, or to do anything that's not 100% ready. And so my word for the year, if that's a word, it's really a number, is 80%. We don't have to have all the answers. But we can agree that God is framing the right questions in our spirit, that God's framing the right questions in our life. And because of that, we're walking down that path and we want to respond now and do the things that God's asked us to do. He sees the water and says, why can't I be baptized? This baptism was a significant thing. And it's interesting that we get to see the fulfillment of all of this process, from having questions to having an understanding and to following through in baptism, because in that we see this picture of baptism that symbolizes a cleansing from almost like a pure life and a pure heart because of the grace of God. It demonstrates a clear break, a clean break from an old life to new. In fact, some historians tell us that in some of the early days that they would baptize, and they would baptize as they would come down from one bank of the river, they would be baptized and they would exit on the other side. It's a picture, this baptism, of making a clean break from an old life to a new life, and he wanted that, and it also demonstrated his union with Christ through something that we have the opportunity to witness on a regular basis: the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. I wonder where our curiosity is. And I wonder how our week might go differently if we are more curious about our faith and about our friends and about the people that we come across. Let's open our life to the questions and embrace the curiosity and let God work through us as we become his evangelist. Let me lead us in prayer.